Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. It is that time once again to talk about everything I watched in the past month. Because I watched quite a bit in March, I'm not going to spend too long rambling, so I'm just going to get straight into it because we got a lot to cover. So the first thing I watched in March was the 2007 English language remake of Funny Games. And for those of you that don't know, Mikkel Haneke, who made the 97 Austrian version, came back and remade the exact same film, shot for shot, in the exact same way, but in English with American actors. And my opinion on this one is weird, because if you saw my video talking about what I watched in February, where I watched the original 97 version of Funny Games, you will know that I thought that film was decent, but there was something holding me back from truly loving it. And the same thing pretty much applies to this remake, because it is exactly the same film in every single way. The location is the same. Every single shot is the same. I'm not over exaggerating here, but this is a literal shot for shot remake of the 97 film. Nothing is changed except for the actors. Everything structurally, tonally, is exactly the same. However, weirdly enough, the one difference I noticed is that the American remake feels like it goes by a lot quicker than the 97 one, and I don't know why. It just feels like this remake is a bit snappier than the original, and that's probably the biggest praise I can give the remake. Apart from that, it still shares the exact same things I liked and didn't like about the original. After that, I then rewatched The Emperor's New Groove for like the 1 billionth time. For those of you that don't know, The Emperor's New Groove is one of my favourite films of all time. It's probably my favourite animated movie of all time. I've watched it probably more times than any other film that's ever been made. Because I watched it a lot as a kid, and I still rewatch it quite a bit now, and every time I rewatch it I still find a ton of stuff to enjoy about the film. And yeah, I don't really have anything new to bring to the table on this one, because this was like my gazillionth watch, and it's still incredibly good. After that, I then went to the cinema to see The Batman. To cut a long story short, I absolutely adore this film. If you watched the video where I talked about The Dark Knight and this film, you will know how much I loved it. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, because trust me, I could spend hours gushing about this film. But everything from its presentation to the performances to the fact that the film as a whole just commits to a specific tone and style and doesn't ever break away from that. I just loved everything about this film, and it's one of those rare films, and you don't get it that much nowadays. Every now and then you do, but it's one of those films where you can tell everyone in terms of the cast and the crew, everyone was on the exact same page in terms of what the end goal was meant to be. Then I watched Pixar's newest film, Turning Red. I'm still rather annoyed that this just got dumped on Disney Plus and didn't get a theatrical release. But trust me, that is a debate all for a completely different video. I quite liked Turning Red. I liked it a lot more than I thought I was going to. I don't think it's one of Pixar's best films, but it's definitely a step in the right direction, because especially with the last few films they've made, even though you've had really good films like Coco or Soul, I do feel like they were kind of almost repeating the same formula a little bit, and they were kind of digging themselves a hole in terms of the consistency of their films. Not necessarily in terms of quality, but in terms of the stuff they were doing. And Turning Red is the first film, probably in quite a while, that feels like Pixar are trying something different in a variety of different ways. Not just in terms of the story they're telling, but in the way that they tell their story as well. Because even though the animation is, typical Pixar, it's gorgeous to look at and it's very vibrant and colourful, the way they do the animation in this film, you can tell that there is a lot of anime influences throughout a variety of different shots in this film. And I loved seeing that in this film, especially with like the facial expressions of the characters and their movements and the way some of the frenetic action scenes play out. But yeah, overall, I really liked Turning Red. I thought it had a brilliant sense of humour that was a little bit much at times, but that being said, I just thought it worked overall, especially for the tone and the story that they were trying to tell. I also thought just the general theme of puberty and that connection between a child and their parents, I thought was really well realised. And overall, I think this film is probably the best example of capturing teenage awkwardness that I've seen probably since Bo Burnham's 8th Grade, because that film captured puberty and teenage awkwardness in a way that felt so excruciatingly real. And though Turning Red takes those aspects and exaggerates it for comedic effect a lot of times in the film, I still think it is one of the best examples of capturing that in a very a very realistic manner. Even though it is exaggerated, you can tell that it's coming from a place of actual honesty. Then I decided to watch Short Term 12, which I think was released back in 2013, and is directed by Destin Daniel Cretton, who made Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. I remember hearing some mostly positive stuff about this film back when it came out several years ago. And also, I know it's quite prominent because it kind of kick-started the careers of Rami Malek, Brie Larson, Lakeith Stanfield, and John Gallagher Jr. They had been in some films before that, but this was the film where they all kind of got their moment to shine, and their careers kind of kick-started from the back of this film. And after watching it, I absolutely adored this film. It starts off like a very typical indie-style film, and I would say the one thing that bugged me at first was the camera work, because I thought it was very all over the gaff. But that being said, the more the movie went on, and the more you get used to these characters and the specific tone it's going for, the camera work didn't bother me at all, and I actually got more used to it the more the film went on. And overall, this is just a really lovely and heartwarming film that really understands the story it's trying to tell and the characters that are at the center of it. After that, I then watched Kogonada's newest film, After Yang. If you've seen the video I did last year about Columbus, which was Kogonada's directorial debut, you will know how much I love that film and what he created with that film. And even though I don't think After Yang is as polished or as cohesive as Columbus, I still think what the film is trying to do is very effective and very good. I would say overall I quite like After Yang, but it will probably take a while for me to fully, get on board with what this film was trying to do. I will say that the film takes a while to really get to what the point of what it's trying to do, because at first I was like, okay, I get the general gist, but it's not really doing anything. And then after something happens and they kind of keep repeating the same thing over and over again, but presenting it in a slightly different way each time, I started to see that the main themes of the film were all regarding like family and identity and memory. And I really liked it when it started to delve into that. And the more it delved into it, the more it went on, the more it felt comfortable in those themes, and the more it felt comfortable to delve into them a bit more. After that, I then watched James Wan's Malignant, which I really wanted to see last year, but unfortunately missed it. So I've only just been able to see it now. I kind of loved this film purely for how batshit crazy it is. The more the film goes on, the more insane and intense it gets, and I just love the fact that every single scene in the film just goes from 0 to 100 and back again in a matter of seconds. Like, it does not wait around. It literally just kind of throws you headfirst into it and expects you to just jump along and carry on with the direction it's going in. And if you are on board, you are in for an incredibly fun and pretty insane film. If you're not on board with it, it probably will lose you within like the first 30 minutes, because it is also one of those films where it deliberately holds back stuff and holds back important information, and when it needs to, it drops everything on you at once in a way that just feels very cathartic, because at the moment you are learning this important information, all the crazy shit starts happening, and it just feels like it's all been building up to that in a really somewhat satisfying way. Then I watched the Japanese horror classic Onibaba. I didn't know what to expect going into this one, other than the fact that, it's regarded as a classic. For a horror film, it's not as scary as I was expecting it to be. And it kind of falls into the same thing that another classic horror film did that I watched a little while ago, called The Uninvited from 1943, I think. That film, when I went into it, I was expecting this kind of horror ghost story stuff, because that's what it was meant to be about. But after watching it, it turns out that the main focus was this romantic melodrama that had a ghost story in the back that was only part of the main thing. And Onibaba is a little bit like that. The main focus is this romantic drama between these characters, and the actual horror aspect of the film doesn't actually play a part in it until like the last act of the film. And unlike The Uninvited, where that actually kind of annoyed me, it actually kind of worked for this film, because I was on board with it for the most part, in terms of what it was trying to do, and the characters and how they were feeling, and how the story just generally progressed. But overall, this was not what I was expecting it to be, so I think it is one of those films that I might have to rewatch at some point, just to kind of let it sink in a bit more. After that, I then watched the Nicholas Roeg classic Walkabout for the first time. Again, I didn't really know much going into this film, other than the fact that it is very highly regarded by quite a few people. I really like this film. Especially to begin with, it was giving me very similar vibes to Terrence Malick's Badlands, which is a film I absolutely love. But as the film goes on, it starts to delve more into a surreal and trippy side of things that I really wasn't expecting. At first, it does seem rather strange, but the more the film goes on, you start to get used to it. The one thing I will say, though, is that there are some scenes where the film just decides to completely leave the main characters and what they're doing, and just focus on these completely random characters that you've never seen before, just doing random stuff. And those scenes did feel really weird and out of place. And even thinking about it now, I'm still not 100% sure why they're in the film. Then I watched the 2-part DC animated film, Batman The Long Halloween. I do think part 2 is a lot stronger than part 1, and whenever animated DC films decide to split the story into 2, the second part does always end up being stronger than the first for some reason. But yeah, I really like this, and I do think it is one of the strongest DC animated films I've seen in a while, especially considering the last few that I've watched, like Batman the Killing Joke or Batman Hush, weren't particularly great, but this is definitely a step in the right direction. The animation is really good, especially for DC animated stuff. Obviously the story is good because it is based off of one of the best Batman stories ever written, so of course the story is going to be good, and the voice acting is also top notch as well. After that, I then watched Mimi Cave's Fresh, which I was very excited to watch because I'd heard a lot of hype around it when it debuted at Sundance back in January, I think. And overall, I really liked this film. I like the fact that the entire first 30 minutes pretty much just presents a very typical rom-com premise. And then as soon as the half an hour mark kicks in, it then starts to delve into what it actually wants to do. And when it does that, it pretty much delves headfirst into it. And I loved how it did that. I feel like my only criticism, so to speak, with the film is that I kind of wish it had delved a bit further into both the horror and comedy aspects of the film. That being said, though, what we do get is very creative, very playful, and just very entertaining. That is probably the best word to describe this film. It is very entertaining. It has a very good sense of humour for what it is. And the main two actors, Sebastian Stan and Daisy Edgar-Jones, both work brilliantly off of each other. And again, they both know exactly what type of film this is, and especially with a few scenes with Sebastian Stan in, he really does understand that the whole tone of this film is being playful and being rather tongue-in-cheek. And then after that, for some reason I decided to watch the original The Fast and the Furious for the first time. For those of you that don't know, I have never seen any of the Fast and Furious films. I know there's about like 9 or 10 of them now, but I have not seen any of them because they've never really appealed to me. But I decided to watch The Fast and the Furious just out of curiosity, and it's fine. It's nothing amazing. I am fully aware that a lot of people say that they get better as they go on. But yeah, this film was just the definition of fine. It was okay. It is one of the most 2000s films I've ever seen, both in terms of its editing and the fact that there is like a Limp Bizkit track playing every 5 fucking seconds. But yeah, it's fine. After that, I then decided to rewatch Constantine from 2005, starring Keanu Reeves. I've always viewed this as a bit of a hidden gem when it comes to comic book movies, because especially when you look at the majority of comic book films released in the 2000s, and having rewatched it for the first time in quite a while, I still think it is a pretty good movie. Visually, it is top notch, and I don't think they could have done any more in terms of its visual style, and I think they nailed the aesthetic of the movie. The performances are really good, even though Keanu Reeves does not make a very comic accurate Constantine. I still think he works well in that role and kind of gives a new kind of perspective on the character of John Constantine. And then after that, I ended the month with the Netflix original film Windfall, which is the newest film by Charlie McDowell, who had previously made The Discovery, which I vaguely remember reviewing back in 2017. I thought that film was fine. It didn't really leave an impact on me. And the same can kind of be said about Windfall. It's fine, but I can't really see myself, revisiting it in the future. That being said, I do love the fact that, because you can tell that this was shot over the pandemic, and I love the fact that the situation of the pandemic has forced a lot of directors and writers to basically make these like very self-contained thrillers just because they want to, and again, it works within the limitations that you face when filming during a pandemic. And Windfall is a pretty decent example of it. I don't think it's as strong of an example than, say, Steven Soderbergh's Kimi that came out earlier this year, because I still think that is one of the best examples of a thriller that was made during the pandemic, and uses its limitations really well. I think Windfall is a fine example. So guys, that was everything that I watched in March. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you watched in March, or your thoughts on some of the films that I talked about in this video. If you liked the video, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Bye.